Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for arriving so promptly. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney Museum, and I'm excited to introduce tonight's program, I Have No Place in the World, a panel discussion on the work of Hélio Oiticica. The occasion for tonight's conversation, as I hope you all know, is of course the extraordinary exhibition of Oiticica's work on view as of today here at the Whitney. Hélio Oiticica to Organize Delirium is the first full-scale US retrospective in 2 decades of the Brazilian artist's work. His was a practice based on a commitment to art that awakens us to our bodies, our senses, our feelings about being in the world, art that challenges us to assume a more active role. The show traces Oiticica's evolution from geometric investigations in painting and drawing to sculpture, architectural installations, writing, film, and large-scale environments of an increasingly immersive nature, works that transform the viewer from a spectator into an active participant. I want to thank my Whitney colleagues, Donna DeSalvo, Deputy Director for International Initiatives and Senior Curator, and Elizabeth Sussman, Curator, and Sandra Gilman, Curator of Photography, for putting together such a smart, sensitive, and beautiful exhibition. I also want to acknowledge the generosity and collaboration of the Oiticica family in the organization of this exhibition, and thank you for being here tonight. In thinking about the conversations that this exhibition would invite, I wanted to highlight 2 things that are special about its presentation at the Whitney. The first is Oiticica's relationship to New York, which is not nearly as well known as his work in Rio in the 1960s. And the second is the resonances of his work for contemporary artists working today. Those were questions that I posed to Irene Small, and I want to acknowledge her generous collaboration in putting together the program. So tonight's program brings together 2 artists and 2 scholars, 2 Brazilians and 2 Americans, to think about the stakes, aesthetic and political, of Oiticica's work, and why, in the words of Holland Cotter in his New York Times review of the exhibition in today's paper, it is, quote, alive in a way almost no art feels now. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in alphabetical order and then turn it over to Irene. Actually, I should introduce you in the order that you're sitting. That would be more logical. So Irene Small is Assistant Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art and Criticism in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University, where she is also an affiliated faculty member in the programs in Media and Modernity, Latin American Studies, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Her essays and criticism have appeared in Art Forum, Third Text, October, and Res Anthropology and Aesthetics, among others. She's the author of Hélio Oiticica, Folding the Frame, and a catalog contributor to Hélio Oiticica to Organize Delirium. And next to her is Matheus Rocha Pitta. I hope I'm saying that correctly, I didn't check. Is a Rio de Janeiro-based artist whose practice spans photography, sculpture, video, and installation. His work has been included in the 29th Sao Paulo Bienal in 2010, the 9th Taipei Biennial in 2014, and in public collections such as the Museum of Modern Art, Rio de Janeiro, and Castello di Rivoli in Turin. He is exhibited in the Musée de Arte de Rio, Brazil, the Fundación Mora Greco in Naples, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and is the recipient of the 2008 Elie Sustain Art Prize Madrid. And then next to him is Fred Coelho, who is Assistant Professor of Literature, Performing Arts, and the Postgraduate Program in Literature, Culture, and Contemporaneity in the Department of Letters at PUC Rio, the Catholic University in Rio. From 2008 to 2010, he worked at the Center for Contemporary Thought in Rio de Janeiro, and in 2009, he was Assistant Curator of Visual Arts at the Museum of Modern Art, Rio de Janeiro. He is currently working on a research project that contextualizes Brazilian counterculture and experimental art in the 1960s and 70s. I hope these are all very up to date. Yeah, so apologies if I realize I didn't confirm all of these things. So, and finally, last but not at all least, Lyle Ashton Harris's artistic practice ranges from photographic media to collage, installation, and performance to investigate the intersections of gender, sexuality, and ethnicity in contemporary culture. He has exhibited at many major institutions, including the Guggenheim, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and in several biennials, including the 2008 Venice Biennale, 2008 Biennial in Busan, and most recently both the 2016 Sao Paulo Biennale, and the 2017 Whitney Biennial. And I think both of those will be under discussion tonight, both of those projects. A recipient of a 2006 Guggenheim Fellowship and a trustee of the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, Lyle is currently an associate professor of art and art education at New York University. So, without further ado, thank you all so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to Irene.
Okay. Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you, Megan, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to just sort of start off with the question of the title that we chose for the panel, which is, I Have No Place in the World. And this was something that Oiticica wrote in this document that you see here when he was in London in 1969. And he writes it after having gone to a series of places. He goes to Paris, where he meets with the editor Jean-Claude of Marable. He goes to Los Angeles, where he participates with Leisha Clark and a symposium on tactile sculpture. And he goes to New York, where he spent 1 week hosted by Rubens Gershman, another Brazilian artist who was living here at the time. And then he goes back to London. And he was in London in the first place to stage a kind of mid-career retrospective that he called the Whitechapel Experience. And so he says, after all of these places, I'm back in London again, and I have no place in the world. And we wanted to, because we're here in New York, which is a place that is so important for Oiticica's work, we wanted to think about this question of transnationalism and what it means to kind of have a practice, think about a critical relationship to one's own practice, one's aesthetic and intellectual constellations. And one of the things that's important in this moment, 1969, in 1970 he participates in the show Information, a very important and famous show that Knudsen McShine curated at the Museum of Modern Art. And this is a really interesting episode to think about. Oiticica had already been quite important in the Brazilian scene. In 1967, he sort of organized an important exhibition, New Brazilian Objectivity, and he created a work called Tropicalia, which is, of course, here in the show. And that was, in some ways, a kind of condensation and manifesto about the Brazilian avant-garde, the state of the Brazilian avant-garde, what it could be. And you see here on the right-hand side this telegram for Knudsen McShine, who had met Oiticica in Rio. And he's invited him to participate in Information, what would become this period-defining show on conceptual art. And he says, think Tropicalia. And it's interesting because he wants to make an international show about these kind of conceptual practices in various parts of the world. And Oiticica does something that is absolutely not Tropicalia. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing the page. McShine gave each artist a page in the Information catalog. So this is Oiticica's page, and he begins by saying, I am not here representing Brazil or anything else. The ideas of representation are over. And so what he's doing at this moment in 1970 is trying to find a way of what he calls, towards the end of this text, a kind of export. In other words, a kind of critical export. And this is interesting because it begins in London when he's planning this so-called Whitechapel experience. This is an image of Tropicalia. And one of the reasons that he wanted to resist the notion of Tropicalia was because of its almost instantaneous absorption and appropriation already in Brazil. So the show opened, I think, in March or around April. In 1967, by September, you see that it becomes the backdrop for this fashion spread. And Tropicalia then became a kind of it was a word associated with a very important musical movement, but also a kind of fashion and style. And Oiticica felt that this was changing and simplifying the complex negotiation of avant-gardism that he was after. So when he started to talk about this retrospective experience he would make in London, he started to think about how to condense some of the ideas that he had been thinking about. in a way that was less maybe iconographic. And the most important thing, at least in my opinion, in terms of what he takes from Tropicalia and the notion of a kind of a Brazilianness that you see here, for example, in his image of a favela in Mangueira in 1965, is the notion of cellular growth. So when he goes to the favela, one of the most important things that he comes away with is this notion of an organic growth that's inherent to the architecture or mode of building. So if in Tropicalia this becomes this structure here.
You have to point here.
No, doesn't work. There. Yeah, no, I did. I'm also magic. If this in some ways looked like a favela or something like a favela, what he tried to do in London was to instead translate what he was most interested in, which is a principle of growth. And so this is one of his earliest studies for Eden, this very large installation that is also here in the exhibition. And what's clearly important for him here is the notion of a cell. So when he is then invited to information in New York, he produces essentially a version of what here in London is, no, it's not working, oops. Okay. Are this, why is this? Okay, well, it's no longer working. But these, what he called nest structures. So they're very simple structures to be in, to lie down in. And for him, these are the kind of generative cells. And so in information, this is what he does in London, in Essex, he does it now for information in New York. And then he also creates it in his own loft in New York. And so what he understood here is a kind of a condensation of this basic idea that he's understanding about Brazil, but he's turning it into something that can be exported, that is free of a notion of representation. So I think this, to me, is a very important way of thinking about a critical practice of displacement and emplacement, because at the end of the day, these are also spaces to place one's body. The other thing that I just wanted to mention before maybe passing over to Matheus is that when we look at something like the nest, what's important here is a structure and the capacity of that structure for growth, right? That's the notion of a cellular growth. And that makes something that looks as simple and sculptural as this kind of pile of stacked bricks actually something quite different. This is a work called Ready Constructible, and he describes it at one point as a model without scale, a maquette without scale. And I think what we're looking at here is really a kind of diagram of growth rather than a kind of form. And so in thinking about this panel, one of the things that was important for us was also to kind of decouple a notion of Oiticica's influence in Brazil or his resonance with contemporary practices, to move it away from something that might look like it's influenced by Oiticica, and to really think more about the kind of conceptual systems, the critical ways in which he thought about his own practice and created series of networks aesthetically. So maybe with that, I can turn it over to Matheus to talk a little bit about Oiticica's influence or a kind of model of thinking in relationship to your own work.
Okay. Thank you, Irene, for the invitation. Thank you for the witness, first and foremost. For an artist from my generation, it seems a little bit impossible not to deal with Oiticica. Not only because of his work, but he wrote extensively and he provided a kind of system or model, and especially in Brazil, where we don't have so much institutions or everything's so precarious. His writings were really, really empowering in a sense, and they also they work as tools for all artists. So, and as Irene was saying, it was a very important tool for me for resisting this idea of representation. And I live in Rio, but I'm not from Rio, so I have a small, a certain distance between the ideas that circulate around Rio de Janeiro, Carnival, Joy, etc. So for example, when I told I was coming here to the Oiticica panels, some people said, but I can see the influence of Oiticica on your work, or anyway. For example, this work was one work that served as a model for a piece I did that Fred was one of the co-curators. The piece is called Circular. Circular in Portuguese is also the name of a bus that makes us like a round trip. And I've been like, I was working with, before that I did some work with cars, and I wanted to think about a collective, because like a car is, it has a psychological extension of your body. I was thinking about how to do this with public transportation, with the bus. And the idea of Circular was to invert, like I was thinking the bus as a distributor of workforce in the city. Nobody takes a bus to see the landscape, like you take a bus to go to the work. And this bus was placed in an exhibition that was made in Favela da Maré, which is one of the biggest favelas in Rio. And my idea was to, instead of having a bus that distributes the workforce in the city, the bus instead would distribute the city. So coming back to Oiticica, the ready constructibles was a model for my, as a diagram for growth, as a maquette without scale. It was a model for me to think about how this distribution would happen. So I placed those maquettes without scale in the place where bodies were being occupied. So there was also an inversion between body and city. So, and all those materials were bought on the nearest shops and the nearest stores, and nothing was taken from the outside. And they were available for like you could take them as well. Like they were, and there was this openness of the work was a little bit polemical. And in the same, this was in 2011. In the same year, remember that was March, right?
March?
Yeah.
No, I think it was September.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Like a month earlier, in August, this is a building that is not so far from Favela da Maré. This was built in the 70s to be the biggest hospital in Latin America. Something happened that half of it was condemned. So what you're seeing here in the background is the half of the hospital that still works. And the other half that was called the dry lag, it was there empty for 30 years, and students from the university would go there and occupy. People from the nearest favela, they would go there to take the windows and all the materials that were available. And during the process of, that Rio suffered the reurbanization of Rio for the Olympics, there was an ideological drive from the government to erase all sorts of failures, of past failures. And that included imploding the dry lag. So they imploded that dry lag in 2010. I was really sad, because I did a work there. One of my first pieces were made inside. I was very, very sad, but I didn't want to make any work about that because I thought it would be very nostalgic. And I said I was not interested in this kind of longing or lament. But then one day, so this, you can see here, the building was cut and then imploded. One day I saw this news, like, I'm just going to translate the headline here. So 1 real, which is the currency, the Brazilian currency is the same, stands for real as well, like for the real as reality. 1 real for 100 tons of rubble. So this news is about a company, a recycling company, that bought in an auction all the rubble. The rubble went on an auction because there was just one company interested. It was sold for the symbolic value of 1 real. And when I saw that news, I said, okay, now I can put I have a project now because this, because there's something going on here. There's a new life of the building, like, and so this work is very related. Like, it's a very nice parallel to circular as well, because it's about the circulation. It's not only it's not exactly about the material, but it's about how the circulation of the material gives a new meaning or a new life for it. So the project involved, I bought from the company a certain amount of that rubble, and I'm just showing here, like, it was a very complex exhibition, but what's important here, it's that this was just a stopover on the life of the material. The stacks you're seeing there, I packed them as commodities. Like, I was interested in, I was not interested in saying, oh, that building shouldn't be destroyed. I was interested exactly on the opposite side, like how's the new life of this material as commodities. So 1/2 of the exhibition was set up as a storage place, and the building where I installed it was also a historical building which in every political change in the country, that building changed functions as well. And it was made on the ground floor that used to be all open. This was a colonial palace, and it had all the panels on the left. There were like 2 gates and several windows that had a lot of permeability with the city. And when it was converted to an art space, they created those white panels to hang art, and I duplicated them, and the rubble was displayed there as if it was also hidden or in a state of clandestinity. And this, after the show, all this rubble went back to the same company. So in the exhibition, it was just exactly a stopover of the life that material was. Just a suspension in time of this strange material, because it was archaeological in a way as well. Like, it was not only there was a very ambivalent, like with 2 highs, I wanted to mean this like ambivalence, and that's something that Oiticica is really important, because he's an artist that is constantly dealing with this ambivalence and raising up this ambivalence, suspending it to making this ambivalence the question, and not and resisting to single-minded readings of yes or no or black and white.
And even at the level of materiality, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to get at in terms of the nests, that they are in some ways, although they are physical, they're a physical scaffold, they're virtualized in some way.
Yeah. And here as well, like this Sergio, the curator I was working with, he said like that the material is derealized. I really like that that idea, and also that was what was interesting. It was like I was not like I was resisting by agreeing with it, by agreeing with this new life of the building as commodity, as and I was creating it like a, I was making resistance by agreeing with it instead of like instead of assuming an idealistic position that shouldn't happen or that shouldn't be done this way. I was instead accelerating it. And
so maybe, I mean, there's just one point, maybe we can move to Fregi, but I think just one point that is important there is this complex relationship between realization, physicality, virtuality, conceptualization. Oiticica has been known in some ways as has been called a conceptual artist, but of course, you know, he resisted, as many other artists did, he resisted that term and at one point said, I hate conceptual art. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting is seeing him sort of come to New York and constellate himself vis-a-vis these other types of categories, thinking all the time about his own trajectory and thinking about form, materiality, and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney, of course, for the invitation. Irene, Matheus, Lyle, it's a pleasure. I will talk a little bit about the moment that Oiticica came to New York, and in the period that he lived at London, he started to work it with many different sources of art. He started to be interested about cinema. He saw Chelsea Girls of Edinburgh at London, and he was just struck for the movie, and he started to thinking about screenwritings. He also lived very near of a musical scene at London, the concerts, the big festivals that at that time was occurring there, like White Island Festival, right? And the Tropicalist composers, Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, they were exiled and lived in London at that time, and Oiticica was part of his crew, let's say that, Brazilian people who lived there, a bunch of artists, etc. And after that, when he came back to Brazil in 1970, he just worked for the Information, and he started to work at movies like scenography, a costume designer. He also started to do music with some friends. Also, Lee Jaff, who is here, was the moment that Oiticica met him in Brazil, and they did music together in different works. Hélio also was a designer, a cover designer of a Gal Costa record, and he just wanted to go out of Brazil again because it was a very repressive moment of our dictatorship in Brazil, of their dictatorship, not our dictatorship in Brazil. And even his hair at that time, he had long hair at that time, was a big trouble for him to walk on the streets or to be in different public spaces. And then he got the grant of Guggenheim Foundation to come to New York. And this image is kind of talking about the story back and forth. Yeah, back and forth, right? Yeah. This is an image of a Conglomerado project. Conglomerado was the last name of a book project that Hélio tried to do. He did it for 5, 6, 7 years here in New York. And you have some documentations about this book project here and the exhibition also. But you can see a lot of files, you know, and this is how Hélio worked. He was a very intensive self-archive. How can you say that?
Self-archivist, yeah.
Self-archivist, yeah. And this is very good for us because now you can see all his work and have, as Matheus said, new generations could have access of his thought.
What he did every day in New York.
Yeah?
He does, you.
Oh, yeah. He lived in New York from December 1970 to maybe the last month, I don't know, November, December of 1977. So it was 7 years here in New York in the street. He did a lot of things in New York, you know. And when he came back to Brazil and someone asked for him, what you did in New York? Because we didn't know anything about your work. There's no installations, there's no exhibitions. And he said, what I did in New York? I did that. I did the Conglomerado. I worked a lot. Maybe it was the moment that I most, that I worked, maybe it was the biggest moment of my life work, you know, was New York. And the book project began called Subterranean Tropicalium Project. Subterranean Tropicalium Project was the project that he sent to Guggenheim. Was a big labyrinth installation that he would like to do at Central Park at that time, but it was not possible. And then he tried to change it for a book project, and it was not possible also because Guggenheim didn't put the money in the book project. And then he started to think, he published just a piece in a magazine called Change magazine, and you have this documentation here in the exhibition, when you can see the Subterranean Tropicalium project installation, and also the beginning of a way to think, a constellar way to think that Hélio called repertory at that time. He connected Brazilian experimental scene from the 70s and New York experimental scene, connects to the counterculture and a lot of things that was occurring in the city at that time. After that, he started thinking about the project and the name of the book project called New Yorkeses, right? And this is like a summary of New Yorkeses. And it's very important to know that Hélio was a typical modern artist in a way that he worked as work in progress all the time. The names of his works was not just names, right? Was like a parangolé, bolide, nuclei, was like names and concepts and also practice. So this is a kind of mixing for him. And New Yorkese became a project of life and also a book project. So you can see here many chapters, right? Chapters, right?
Yeah. You have to point there, like to.
No, it's there. It's okay. Yeah. I got it, man.
Sorry.
So it's like.
That's a laser
So
icon.
just with these 2 pages, you can see how many ideas, names, and works Hélio was trying to figure out together with his work, right? So you have Yoko Ono, Carlos Vergara, Quentin Fiore. You have works like Estonia and Shelter Shield was related with Rolling Stones. You know, for Hélio at that time, Mick Jagger and Jimi Hendrix was so important as, I don't know, as Pound or Marshall McLuhan. They were at the same place for his mind and for his ideas, right? And then he used a lot of excerpts of his songs to thinking about his work, right? And here you can see the Brazilian experimentality was the beginning of Subterranean Tropicalium project. So you see Lígia Pape here, Antônio Manuel, Lígia Clark, Antônio Dias, and all of these names connected with his works, right? In this section here, you can see the Bodywise section. Bodywise was one of the documents for New Yorkese that you can say that, it's a kind of complicated to say that to Hélio, but it's a kind of finish it for him, because he made the Portuguese version and he made the English version of this document, right? And we also have this document here and the exhibition with the beautiful voice of Arthur Lindsay reading the document. It's amazing to hear Arthur Lindsay reading this document. This is the Bodywise, the English version, right? So Hélio has this amazing capacity of giving to researchers the perfect exactly moment, you know, that he was writing, like June 22, 73, New York, AGO, his initials for Bodywise, you know, is everything here. And he was already thinking like a cut and paste mind, you know. He just cut the part of a book and just paste here, you know. And you have here all the way of Hélio's mind at the time. And this is for him, was not just like a piece of paper, like, oh, like I wrote some ideas. This is the work for him, right? New Yorkese was his real work at that time in New York. Of course, he made a lot of different works in New York, a lot like Cosmococas and different installations that he just put back on, oh my God. All right, he did a lot of works in New York at that time. And Bodywise was a kind of document, a kind of chapter for New Yorkese, and you can see this is a report. Rolling Stone is the magazine. He talked about that, you know, exactly the idea that he was trying to put here about the new way to think the use of the body in his work, because everybody thinks that the strong connection between the samba dance, the parangolé, and the Brazilian body is the mainly part of Hélio Oiticica's work. But here in New York, he was just start to thinking about that work connected with rock and roll. Rock became more important for him than samba at that time, and you can see that because even the parangolés in New York was a totally different form of parangolé from Brazil. They're more structured, they are different, and Hélio was, as I saying, he was a work in progress guy all the time, changing even the ideas and the works. Here you can see also a Marshall McLuhan excerpt, right? So you have here just in 3 pieces, Rolling Stones, Lígia Clark, Haroldo de Campos, Marshall McLuhan. And this is a card that was playing in this part, body-wise, in New Yorkers. This is the New Yorkers name, right? 19 July 73. And also you can see here a lot of people that Hélio put on this document. Some of these names was not in the final version, right? But you can see together Haroldo de Campos, McLuhan, Arthur, Alice Cooper, Merleau-Ponty, Pound, Ezra Pound, right? His own notes here, my notes. Central Park Notebook, New Notebook, Whitechapel Catalog, GAN Magazine is a Brazilian magazine for art, Parangolé 964 tests, always from New Notebooks, Maniacs, etc., quotation. Maniacs is because in this Rolling Stone issue, talking about a Rolling Stones concert at Hawaii, Hélio was stricken by the idea that people was trying to grab Mick Jagger on the stage. And then he created this neologism called maniacs. Maniacs is in Brazil, hands in Brazil, it's mãos. So this is the hand maniacs, right? Try to grab the road. Here you can see, split the test and insert at this point the photo of Alice Cooper audience, interview Rolling Stone magazine. And then with this documentation of Body-Wise, Hélio put together also some different reference for him. Vitor Conte at that time was a big reference for Hélio by his work with body, and Hélio was very interested about Conte work at that time.
Just a quick note in there that Akanchi was also in information and has quite interesting things to say about the nests that were in information and about the relationship between the public and private. And Akanchi actually says that Oiticica was thinking about things before Akanchi himself was.
Yeah. And here you can see the 2 Rolling Stones magazines that he used for Body-Wise document, right? This is the magazine with the Maniacs concert, and this is the Alice Cooper interview with Liza Minnelli's private lives, right? So, of course, this is just a little piece of what Oiticica did here in New York, but the idea is to show how he was thinking at that time, because he was mainly, this is funny to say, but the first thing that Hélio did as an artist in his life was writing some plays, some theater plays, right? From his childhood, from his 11, 12, 13 years. So the first thing that Hélio did in his life was writing. And he kept writing for his whole life, you know? And in New York, after the London experience at Whitechapel, after the information, and after the idea that he has no place in the world, New York for him, he called New York as a nest also, right? The Babylon nest is the place that he could work by himself, and he had a lot of friends, Brazilian friends here, working with him, and even New Yorker friends, and even French friends like Martin Barra, who lived here also. And he created a big net, right? How do you say that?
Network.
A network, yeah, a big network. And you can see that in his documents at that time, because he put all the things that he was reading, listening, and viewing in his writings at that time. And I hope that in the future we can see and can read more these documentations here in New York, because it's very important to understand not just the works of Hélio Oiticica, but also the role of Latin America and mainly a Brazilian artist in the 70s in New York, because he was not trying to get inside the New York art scene. This is a kind of strange for us who study Oiticica all the time. We are asking why he was not trying to connect it with this art scene. But we also know that Hélio was doing his own work in his own way with some friends, with some partners as Neville also, who is here, is a co-author of the Cosmococcus. And we have a lot of works with different people, and it's very important to know that the idea of transnational artists at that time maybe was not the key idea for him, but he was living like that already. And I will now pass the mic for Lyle, right, to talk about his experience, his recent experience in the Biennial of São Paulo and the transnational situation of his work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening. Firstly, I would like to thank Irene Small for inviting me to take part in this discussion, and thank you, Fred and Matheus. It's great to meet you. And also thank the Whitney, the Carnegie, and the Art Institute for allowing us to encounter this remarkable work in person. Congratulations to Elizabeth Sussman and Donna DeSalvo on an elegant and thoughtful install. One of the things that really struck me upon seeing the exhibition a week ago for the first time was the breadth of Oiticica's work, its freshness, particularly since it was created 50 years ago. I was really drawn to its intimate qualities, his use of the performative, and his engagement with disparate materials as a way to seduce viewers in a playful way and a kind of dance of the imagination that implicates viewers. Having myself worked with some similar strategies over the past couple of decades, I also felt compelled to further explore what his work is all about, that it will repay my curiosity by continuing to open up more of the secrets to me. I find myself especially drawn and can relate to the source of Oiticica's distinctive aesthetic energy, the textures, bodies of knowledge, and flesh from both the southern and northern hemisphere, melding influences drawn from the so-called developing nations as well as from European American culture. Allowing this complex intermingling, especially the ambivalences, the contradictions, not merely to coexist, but in certain ways to triumph. To draw out some of the particular resonances I discovered in Oiticica's work, let me share with you some of my own work in various media and themes that I continue to explore. So Irene asked me to talk a little bit about my project in Brazil, which is titled Uma Vez, which means once. And this was the first, I guess, iteration of a project that I had began. I discovered this archive after returning and living in Ghana for 7 years, I would discover this archive of mine of over a few thousand Echtachrome slides, journals that were taken from between the mid-'80s and '90s, and upon returning from Ghana. And it was after being in Ghana, which was, I'll talk about a little later, but it was the idea of coming back to New York and rediscovering the past in a way. And in no way this was meant to be nostalgic, but it was a way of how do you imagine the future by looking at the past, et cetera. So I think it's important to talk about that. But the installation, as you can see here, had a double-sided mirror, so one architectural intervention, so one could actually see within the space itself, but also the viewers inside were actually implicated in the act of seeing their reflection. On the outside was a journal. As I mentioned, I discovered several journals, over 150 to be exact, and this is one, the Orange Journal from 1997, and just forward a little bit. And the journals consist of, let's say, sex ads for Hustlers, the national, flower of South Africa, Haile Selassie on the left, a self-portrait on a sex line in the early '80s, etc. In addition to the installation inside, there was also a continuation of this collages I began making, really blow-ups. I began on sublaunches, began making by mid-2000, 2005 to be exact. And when I got to Brazil, obviously everything was made before, but this was something that I actually made on site. And I wasn't intended to bring it, but the last couple of days before packing up and working for 5 months on the installation, I said, let me just take some tokens and actually put in my suitcase. But it was amazing just to see the energy that drew. And people were drawn to the other work, but something about the collage itself and actually making it on site and including several materials from Brazil. For example, the recently disposed, president. Also, the famous painting of Brazil about about ham in terms of the whitening of Brazil. And so it was like certain references that were used in the collage to somehow signify, but also to draw the energy from Brazilian culture. So this is the inside the installation. And a lot of these, I guess, more temporal engagement with images, sort of similar to Oiticica in a sense, moving away from, let's say, the more two-dimensional, let's say, painting, I might say, for photography to create like a more multi-dimensional use of space, etc. For me, has its roots in the early watering holes from '96, where moving away from iconic images and really trying to think about disparate, high-low, what does it mean to bring in appropriate images, almost images I created, and have them somehow cause a combustion, if you will. And this is an early work I wanted to share. But they anticipate these large-scale collages, assemblages. In fact, I'm still trying to figure out what the name is for them. Because it's not exactly collage. Is it assemblage? I'm not really sure, but just trying to think, because they are more immersive, if you will. And I was very much interested in the tactile quality, but also bringing disparate elements and, in a way, allowing for the viewer to find multiple entry points, etc. The center panel, this is the last of the blow-ups, is speaking of transnationalism. I was living in Rome when the Pitta Rome in 2000, and I was doing a story on Italian soccer, racism in Italian soccer. I'll forward and see it right here. But while doing research for that particular story, I came across the center panel right here in a newspaper, the daily Italian sports newspaper, which is Zidane getting a foot massage by an unidentified brown-skinned model. And I was struck, speaking of ambivalence, how this one text was a site for critique of, let's say, racialized design in sports, but also became a site, let's say, of pleasure, hence the semen on the original newsprint that has been blown up in terms of monstrous proportions, etc. So this is just a story I did for the New York Times Magazine, looking at race in Italy, and I was very much struck by Thuram, who was, as you know, is the most highest capped player in the French division, and what it meant for him to be living in Italy at the same time having, being the highest capped player, but having bottles and bananas being thrown to him, calling him a nigger, monkey, or squad the nigger, etc. So very much interested in that tension that existed between race, desire, commodification, the body, etc. So I mentioned in 2005, I got invited to go to Ghana, and I was a professor at NYU, and NYU had begun to the global mission to have students be able to experience the world in a much more larger dimension, and Ghana was the last, I believe at that time, was the only site on the continent. And this was actually done in 2008, and it was done in Medina. It was the last day of Ramadan, the celebration, and pretty much the idea of, looking, the subjects themselves range from ethnographic images, but also, for example, this was the housekeeper, if you will, the grounds man at this place I was staying, which was the Scott House. I was staying in the glass house. It was the first glass house built in Northern Africa, West Africa, and it was built, I believe, in '59, 2 years after independence, and was in Domus magazine in '92. So this is me actually looking at the subject through the glass itself. So I lived, it's interesting hearing Oiticica talk about the idea of being in exile, because I am an American, but I think it wasn't until going to living in Tanzania as a child, I was thinking, the last couple of days sleeping and dreaming Oiticica and thinking about, I'm an American, but what my life would be like today if I did not have a mother who took her 2 sons to Tanzania in the mid-'70s, I would not be in this chair right now. It would be a different figuration, if you will, and thinking what it meant to be a child living in Tanzania, going there, as a young African American and being in an all-black kind of an African country, black, it was in it was right after Ujima. It was during Ujima, it's right after independence. And then again, my father being South African, so having that relationship to South Africa, growing up in the Bronx and having, let's say, the ANC has part of its headquarters in the house, and at the time when the ANC office in Midtown was being bugged, that a lot of offices, the meetings are being held at the house in the Bronx. So I'm interested in this idea of like, I guess, transnational, transcultural, what does it mean to occupy multiple space and multiple positions at the same time, not to mention, trans in the most recent iteration as we talk about it. So this is, so this is a video. I'm gonna speed on so we can. So I'm going to go through these quickly. So ebony was something, thinking of when I first encountered this fisherman in Accra. I was doing a story illustrating Anthony Appiah's cover story for the New York Times Magazine on cosmopolitanism in terms of like really trying to descend to the notion of, let's say, the West, the fact that one can find international within the local realm. And I remember being asked to go by my editor, New York Times, to go photograph a Ghanaian wearing traditional outfit holding a cell phone as if that was an anomaly. But in actuality, it was shocking to the fact that even, family members, not my close family, but, was shocked to somehow see a Ghanaian holding a cell phone when in actuality they are much more advanced in terms of using technology for competing, for example, this fisherman, knowing what the local fishermen in Togo might be doing for charging for tilapia or the market woman. So I was very much interested in using, let's say, photography, images as a way to somehow challenge your representations around the other, etc. So this is ebony, and this piece right here, this is collaborated with Nicholas Roy, who was a sign painter, and this piece itself was inspired by, it was an American who was visiting, European American, and he was talking about Michael Jackson and in a very disparaging way, and I thought about what would it mean to somehow draw a certain transnationalism of Michael Jackson and how that particular figure figures internationally and the type of energy that he has brought in different spheres that may not be, through American paradigm or lens. So we can talk about this one later, but this is, my dear friend, publisher, Greg Miller was visiting town, and after coming from dinner, my next door neighbor was, she had 2 gay sons. She owned the equivalent of, let's say, a convenience store, and I had never, I was out, but at the same time, being from a certain social class, I had never encountered queer people in Ghana dominating, taking over public space. And this is in contradistinction to the type of stereotypes we have around, violence against homosexuals. Not that it does not exist, but the fact that this is a radical different reading of that space, et cetera, and what it meant to somehow occupy that space. In 2005, when I first went over to Ghana, I encountered this prison, Jamestown prison, and similar to Matheus is talking in terms of that particular hospital during the Olympics. Similarly, Jamestown with the 2007 50th anniversary, this prison, which is formerly 1670 fort, became a slave fort, then in early 20th century prison, and I was able to get in 2007 after they had a beautification of the site, and because a lot of Ghanaians returning, if you will, back to the country to celebrate, etc., I was able to get in, and I was struck by the uncanny resemblance with this mark making by these male prisoners. I mean, thinking about what was the fixative? I mean, was it, they didn't have obviously almost glue or scissors, was it semen? What was used to somehow, the notion of the cut, thinking about Hana Hawk, thinking about how one actually creates desire, particularly since Ghana being a middle class country, what does it mean to be looking at these tropes of the other, desire, etc., from an incarcerated position? So after seeing these collages, I was just struck, in a way that it challenged my sense of Ghana in a way, because, as you know, Ghana is a middle-class country, and that people can be living anywhere, people are dealing with, but upon arriving there, they almost take on the notion of, let's say, the traditional. And I was struck by how within the collages, within incarcerated men, were actually challenging that and they're bringing notions of modernity, et cetera. So. So this is Black Power. It's titled, takes its title again, in relation to the thinker in terms of public cinema. I was very much interested in the idea of the relationship to the mirror. This is the gym. This is not Bailey's gym or, you know, the gym you access, you know. I was able to access my you guys in the frame right there, Prince. And I was very much interested in the recording in terms of have access to the internet, you know, we're very much aware of the value of the body within the Western imagination, if you will. So there was an exchange of gifts, getting to know each other before I could actually access the gym. But I was very much interested in the terms of the body, desire, but also getting to know the circulation, like the clothing that was used in the global
saying to you earlier that one of the things that I really love about this is the focus on the mirror, and so that the production of the desire of the Black male body is already turned into very
Okay. So this is interesting. Well, I think I'll let you can read this, and I'll move on. If we're going to discuss the video afterwards in relationship to this, we can. So this was the last iteration, the New York mix of the Ektachrome archive, and I was, thinking of what does it mean to, in relationship to a lot of Oiticica's work in terms of what does it mean, because I can identify a lot in terms of particularly the goal of the nest, the New York, the Babylon nest, and I was very much interested in terms of the affinity with the tropes of the erotic or the erotic looking, and there was a sense that it did hark back to some of the threads, if you will, of my Ektachrome archive, but I was also interested in this particular installation in the reimagining of the archive. What does it mean to rub up against other social spaces within that? Because I can identify with the longing that is articulated within the work, Neurotica, but I'm also, what does it mean to cause a rupture in that, if that makes any sense. So here you have, let's say whether that's Thelma or Gary Simmons, or let's take the next one, for example, Manning Marable, the late great Manning Marable, who did his most famous work, was the biography of Malcolm X on his deathbed. As you remember, the reaction that he had from the community from that, and to have that rub up against this image of a gay queer club in New York space that no longer exists. And I'm interested in have a project that actually forces one to encounter the connection, the overlapping of that, as opposed to seeing it as bifurcated or separate. And I think that's something I think is sort of the hallmark of the work, et cetera. How do you make people reimagine other possibilities of a world where those spaces actually do coexist, as opposed to the closet or, so I think that's something I'm interested in. I think that's a thread that I want to talk a little bit about, so. So I'll just end there, so.
Yeah. Can I have, I just wanted to jump in here because I think one of, when I saw the work, Lyle's work in Brazil, and then of course I also saw the iteration of the work here at the Whitney, and I was, earlier you talked about the kind of multiple temporalities that are in this work, once again, now. And I think one of the things that I felt was really important is the way in which showing this work now looking back to the 1980s and 90s, compels us to rethink some really central concepts or terms that we have started to use as shortcuts for much more complex ideas. So something like the politics of representation or identity politics. And when Oiticica was first sort of absorbed into the international, the kind of global art world, he was often, his work was compelled to represent Brazil and everything about Brazil. So anthropophagia, the notion of cannibalism, the favela. Sometimes people thought, oh, he was from the favelas, that he was mulatto, for example. And this really had the effect of simplifying and flattening out a much, much more complex way of articulating and engaging with difference and questions of otherness that were much more both ambivalent and even at times antagonistic. And so one of the things that I think is nice about looking at Oiticica's work, again, thinking about it in relationship to some practices that would not necessarily be immediately cognate, for example, as Lyle's, but also thinking about the New York years, is that in New York he starts to rethink some of the ways he had previously thought about, the parangolé, samba, identity. And he becomes interested in identity, what we would call these kind of burgeoning identity movements. And I just wanted to quote from a letter that he writes in 1971. And he was describing going to a kind of avant-garde poetry reading. And he said, what is that compared to the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, women's lib, and gay movements? Nothing. And so what I took from that, and these here are photographs that he took at a women's liberation march. It's not a work per se, but it's a kind of a trace of what he was interested in. And at the bottom, there is some just short Super 8 footage of one of the first gay pride parades in New York. Is that he's really thinking of these burgeoning movements not as a kind of politics of representation in the sense that these are identities that pre-exist and are then rendered visible, but rather radical aesthetic acts of construction in the public. And I think that, because he'd always, coming from geometric abstraction, he was always working against representation to a certain degree, and we saw that already in terms of the rejection of Tropicalia as a representation of Brazil, right? But I think it's important to sort of note how that's also drawn into something like identity, and how thinking about Oiticica in New York can also help us unlock some of the formulations that have mushroomed around something like identity politics and fixed, in some ways, work and thinking around the 80s and the 90s into codified terms. So, yeah.
Let's just say that he also was trying to figure out some ways to work as a collective way, like Word as Shelter or even the Leisure that we see in Eden, like this kind of manifestations for him maybe was a way to think how you can put yourself as an artistic body, or experimental body in the collective scene or in collective political movement at the same time. I think this is also a very important way to think his interest about all the political movements at that time.
Right. I mean, this image here is, a still of these men who are like relaxing after the parade in Central Park, but I'm not sure if I have a, right. So on the left, you're seeing images from Oiticica's work Neurotica. And so he's finding in life, in these burgeoning social movements, these kinds of practices that construct a certain notion of eros in public space, and also this concept of cri lazare, which I also think is important in terms of Lyle's work. Cri lazare or cri leisure is a neologism of his making, which means sort of to create leisure, laziness. Wally Salamel, the poet, has a really beautiful way of describing it, which I think really I thought of when I saw the Ectochrome archive, Lyle. He says there's an erotic relationship here. This is Wally Salamel, the Brazilian poet, talking about the cosmococcas. There is an erotic relationship here, eroticism light, something like a sensual inaction, dissipation, the pleasure of time without immediacy, a time of vacancy, a time of eternity, a time without intentions. And so what he's talking about here is both temporality and eros as de-instrumentalized. And this is something that he sees, for example, here in terms of the gay pride parade, but he's also working towards. So I just...
It might be helpful to talk a little about what was happening in Brazil along those issues, at the same time, because I think, it also talks, you say it's about creating community, but it's also about like longing what could possibly happen. And I'm just wondering, like, what were the similar movements, if any, that were happening? Is that...
Well, I don't know,
Yeah.
Freddy, if you want to...
If this kind of movements
Or
at that
feminism,
was
yeah.
at that time Brazil, we were in the peak of dictatorship, So this is more like connected with any kind of left-wing strike, left-wing movements at that time, very mixed. The feminism and like racial issue at that time in Brazil was zero, practically zero for this kind of
Well,
movements.
the movimento Afro was started in like 1978.
The 78,
Yeah.
we're talking about
So,
71, 72.
right.
So like in the end of dictatorship, all these North American identity movements became very strong in Brazil after the end of dictatorship. But at that moment, everything was too mixed between the fight against dictatorship. So identity was more like left-wing identity for all, for everybody. And after that, when the dictatorship became more soft, as you can say that, now and then identity movements, they became big in Brazil in the end of the 70s. But at that moment, maybe that's why I'm saying for Hélio, to see that in New York was such a strong proof of freedom, of collective freedom. And you can see that in his writings at the time, that the idea that you can work in a public space, and he came back to Brazil thinking about working in public spaces. Maybe this is the big contribution of New Yorkers for his work at that time. Not just the engagement about political issues, new political issues, and it's a shame because Hélio, he died so early that we didn't know how he could put that forward in his work. But at that moment, I think this is the mainly discussion for him. You can occupy public spaces with political issues and artistic manifestations, like performing.
Right. Maybe when we were talking about this, the three of us, we had talked about also the importance, the inescapability of thinking about art and politics. And one of the things that is most useful, I think, for me, as someone who's invested and thinks about art and art history and its capacities, is Oiticica's very nuanced relationship to the political. There was a moment that he was asked about his, what the relationship between art and politics during the dictatorship. And he says that messages never really work. They're really reformist rather than radical. And I think this question of how to create a kind of complex articulation of politics that avoids simplistic means of responding to domination or oppression by simply inverting it is something that's really key. And that's something that you and I have talked about. So maybe just to finish off, you might talk a little bit about the question of art and politics. Oh, and Brazil.
He wrote in 1970, right?
70.
A text that for me I think is one of the most important, called Brazil Diarrhea. Brazilian culture is very famous for, anthropophagy is a very famous operation in Brazilian culture that we would have a privileged position to observe different cultures and create our culture wouldn't be absorbed, eat it, and we have this digestive metaphor that we could eat the other and produce something new, vomit and Oiticica here takes this seriously, and also like when he names Brazil Diarrhea, like he's making a certain critic of the anthropophagy as well, because with diarrhea, he's talking about delusion. I think he took this term from a poet, like from American poet, like they have these categories of creators,
Diluters.
Diluters, yeah.
Nobody wants to do
so
that.
And this is, he wrote that in January of 1970, so he just came back from London at that moment,
Yeah.
you know? So it's like fresh, he came back to Brazil and wrote that like that, you know?
So he's speaking basically of the difficulty in Brazilian culture to put a question, because this culture that observes everything, like it also dilutes everything. And he's also criticizing, at the time in Brazil, there was a lot of, the left was involved in a very essentialist politics about the CPC, as
Yes.
sort of popular culture. There was a sort of nostalgia about what Brazil would be investment in popular culture, etc. So he's like both criticizing this essentialist left and a certain conservative idealistic position. And he writes like the last, he's like trying to define his position. He says that there is no experimental art, but the experimental, and that's something that proposed transformations, that means like that demands an ethical, like the assuming of an ethical position. And that for me was, I never thought, I started to think that consciously after Irene's invitation. I did a piece that was like, as Irene said, that messages are not, doesn't have any efficacy. I started to be interested in gestures and making gestures available. So this project was called The First Stone, and it was the sculpture you've seen there. This was made available in the exhibition. The first row, so viewers would arrive in the exhibition and they could have this sculpture, which was produced with an open edition. But in order to own that sculpture that was signed and dated, it was written on the cardboard there on the bottom. The first stone that you find on the street can be exchanged by this sculpture. Please refer to the gallery staff to effect the transaction. So I was actually, the work is a sculpture, but I was actually making this gesture available. You had to go outside in the street and find the first stone that fills your hand. It's not any, it's like a gun in a way, like so. The title comes from the Bible, like the story from the first stone. The first stone is the stone that you do not throw, that you do not exert violence. And while going out of the gallery, going to the streets and carrying this stone, this suddenly becomes like a object, like relational object. Like it empowers you, and the idea is not to throw the stones, but like to feel like people look at you in the street like carrying a stone. Like it's. And so in the work is the stones are made available according to the demand. This image was taken after the opening. When the exhibition opened, there was only one row of first stone. So what you see in the bottom are like all the stones that were collected. So this multiple is converted in one single collection of stones. And together with this work, it was showing this concrete slabs with this archive. It's called The Agreement. Several years ago, I read an interview by Thomas Hirschhorn. He was speaking about Andy Warhol. He said that he loved Andy Warhol because Warhol was the artist of agreement. He agreed with reality in order to change it. That you cannot change reality unless you agree with it. And when I read that, I was struck because we are used to think about political art as resistance, as going against something. And Thomas Hirschhorn is saying something that is completely paradoxical. And so years later, I think that the thing with the agreement became something I observed so much it became unconscious. And I started to I collect compulsively newspaper images. I started to collect all images of agreements, of people making agreements, like holding hands, hugging, shaking, kissing, and this was shown. All this, what you can see in the background was this one-by-one concrete slabs with these images. They were organized by size, so there was no hierarchy between sportsmen and politicians. Everybody was agreeing and shaking. And coming back to delusion, there was Sérgio Buarque de Holanda once said that the Brazilian is the cordial man, which is the man of agreement. The Brazilian soul is like cordial, like he's very sweet, like he doesn't have subjectives because he's always saying yes to everything. So that's exactly, we can like juxtapose that.
But he said that in a meaning way, you know that, right?
Yeah, I know. No, he was being critical.
Yeah.
But if you juxtapose that to the delusion in diarrhea, it's really interesting. And so the agreement in Brazil, which in Portuguese is acordo, is the same root for cordial.
Never thought of that.
And it was really funny because the first time I showed this work was in Italy, and everybody loved it. And in Brazil, it was neither my leftist friend liked it because there was a lot of politicians from the left agreeing with
right people,
and the people from the right, they hated it because there was lots of images of Lula and Dilma. Then Dilma was the president. It was obvious that she would appear all the time. So the work, like politically, it had this. I was really surprised because I showed it 1 year before in Italy, and the reception was much more warmer, and it really bothered people. Some people said they felt their stomach churn. And I think this work is about love as well. Like there's a very strange erotic thing about it. It's just bodies. This is a performance, like the gesture of the first one is like I'm asking people to perform and to work for me. They are collecting. Here, people are like also performing something, and it's very bodily. And again, I was bringing this work because I wanted to think about delusion and within the diarrhea paradigm.
Yeah, because Hélio also talked about the convenience, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's very convenient to make agreements,
exactly.
in Brazil.
Which is a kind of conformism.
Yeah. I think that we are supposed to turn over to Q&A, but I just wanted to add in that Brazil diarrhea text that Oiticica says that, that the delusion is there, but that we have to plunge into the shit,
Yeah.
So,
I agree with the shit.
yeah.
Thank you.
Isso foi em 2014.
Eu não, vai ser conectado.
Are there any questions?
Acho que as pessoas não podiam ficar no mesmo lápide. Era uma mão apertando.
Thank you for the very interesting conversation. And this came up in the panel, and I know that it's a difficult question to pose, but I'm curious if any of you could imagine what Hélio would have done would he have lived longer after returning from New York. Because it is true that he died so shortly after arriving back to Brazil. And it begs the question, given that New York is such a visceral city, as much as Brazil can be, I would imagine that the city itself had a huge impact in how these bodily actions would have impacted the work and the writing, because they really do go hand by hand. So without asking too much, if you could maybe imagine what would have he brought to us should he have lived more than he did?
We're always asking that for, because he was a kind of, that document that we saw, right? You can think about hyperlinks, right? he was a kind of internet mind guy. He was reading everything, connecting everything, file everything. So he has this kind of organized mind, no? But at the same time, as the exhibition, the name of the exhibition, to Organize Delirium, he has these two sides of his life very strong. But you can see something like that. In the 1984 in Rio, we have this huge exhibition celebrating the new moment of painter in Rio, in Brazil. It's a kind of the Geração 80, I'm saying, the generation from 80s. Was a huge exhibition, bring back the figuration, you know, the celebrating of the bidimensional painter. So it's like for him, he said something like, I don't believe anymore in this kind of art. So my guess, I'm not sure if Irene said it, but my guess, maybe he could travel again outside Brazil. Maybe he was not staying in Brazil for that moment. I'm not sure, but because he was trying to do some occupations in public spaces, and at that moment in Brazil, as we know right now, the Brazilian history at that moment, it would be probably impossible to do that, you know? But it's just my guess. Maybe he was living, he could live outside Brazil, you know what I mean? I don't know. I really don't know.
I mean, it's complicated because, I mean, how do you imagine? I think even like Basquiat, I mean, the reality is we're doing what he wanted us to do by having this discussion or this exhibition. This is the work. I mean, I think it's really hard to project what happens after, you know, someone dies, etc. I think it's all conjecture at that. I mean, for me, it's all conjecture at that particular point. Yeah. So how do we deal with what we actually have? I mean, one question I did have with the unpublished book that you wrote brilliantly about, what are the plans for manifesting that? I mean, because that's something that are traces that could actually be manifested. So
what we know that he said, I'm just beginning. Just 1 year before he died, he said that. I'm just in the beginning. You know, he died with my age, and I'm just in the beginning. I hope so. So it's like, it's unbelievable. His mind, you can think like that. He worked but like 3 decades. Half of the 50s, the 60s, or like, all right, now I'm not an artist. The 70s was like, all right, let me think the new movement, and then he died. In the moment of the new movement, you know what I mean? Probably the book project would be launched little by little. Probably he will work with new artists because he loved to work with different people. His friends were there. Neville was there working a lot at that time. Wally Salomon was there working a lot at that time. Caetano Veloso was there. So probably you can see that in his notebooks at that moment. He was so excited about Brazilian cultural life, the movies, the concerts. He was looking for something new there, you know, and he was doing new works, different one. So it's complicated.
And it's complicated because even thinking he left what year in 70? When did he leave New York?
77.
So
End of 77.
Let's say the AIDS crisis in the U.S. So clearly there were, you know, thousands and thousands of artists, you know, people who died, you know, a large fraction of people in the creative field. So we can always imagine what they could have done, but the question is, what do we do with the archive? It seems to me that the book you mentioned, the unpublished book, what are the plans for that coming out? Are there plans for that, or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. He was saying something like that in the interviews at that time.
My question to you, are there plans as an art historian, or are the institutions actually, or publishers, that are thinking about publishing the unpublished book?
You're saying at that time or right now?
Now.
Cezinha could say that better than me, but we made.
That everybody has this question. Fernando Coquerari used to joke if I knew I was doing it.
Yeah.
I think if he take his time to do all the projects he started in New York, could take the rest of his life. I think.
It's true.
So he already have a lot to do through his own writings and projects. So I think just it was a mission for the entire life.
Yeah.
The
As
other
we
thing
are
I wanted-
working on it until now and didn't finish even the
We
one
made-
quarter of it.
We made a book with part of the New York documents, right? And this is very important today because there was a lack of documents from Hélio because we had a book from the 80s with documentations by 50s and 60s, but it ended in 69 with this long document. And then after that, take a long time to be able to read the 70s documentations, and now we can read that with new books that we are publishing there.
Another thing, I think he was working a lot with new things. I see all the time his last works, mainly the performance instructions, more as play or the films.
Yeah.
And he was talking a lot to work with other things, like kind of, not very happy with the, ways that art was going in Brazil, like
Yeah.
the art world in Brazil mainly. So there is a lot. But one thing that he talks a lot in the writings, and you know that, is he wants to publish everything that he did in
Yeah.
New York. And,
Yeah.
as to with Cosmo Cocker, he always said
Yeah.
he wants first publish the book, then to start to show. So just to publish everything was, and to make people publish is a big work at that time, mainly in Brazil. Maybe that's why one of the first things in the project, when they start there in 82, one of the main goals was to publish the first book.
The first and very important book.
There's just one other thing. Can I just jump in here for a second? Because the other thing that I think is important about the end of his life was that when he returned, he was already becoming something of a legend. I mean, he was already in some ways a legend. And there started in the late 70s the first kind of critical look at neo-concretism and all of these things. And we see him very carefully looking at his own practice and trying to find ways of reactivating the kind of radical potential of some of these works so that they would not fall into a more static category of, say, sculpture. So the contrabolide, the counterbolide, for example, is an invention that he makes, right before he dies, which is an attempt to, in some ways, recuperate the radical potential of this earlier order of work he called the bolide. And that was specifically because the bolides had then started to become exhibited as elements of 1960s Brazilian art. Right?
Sculptures.
So as sculptures. And so it's like, how does I think he was very interested and concerned with always reactivating the kind of potential of these things through new kind of mutations of them, or a kind of rhizomatic unfolding. I think way back there.
Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. This question is mostly for Lyle. I was curious in what ways Oiticica's notions of participation played into your own work in thinking about perhaps like an erotics of participation. In what way in your sort of installations you sort of are walking through and you're immersed within this certain world, and in a lot of Oiticica's work there's a lot of sensuous elements like sand and rocks, and I was curious in what ways his notions of participation played into your own work.
Good question. I think more in terms of the performative work that I've done. I was thinking, I didn't show that here, but for example, the Michael Jackson performance that I did, where breaking that fourth wall and really trying to break down the split between audience and viewer, and really trying to activate that. And that's one example. I think also in terms of with the large assemblages, really trying to moving behind fetishizing the iconic image and really trying to bring in disparate elements. I remember when I, given the content, if you will, of some of my early work, I found that with the blow-ups, by sourcing, let's say, archival images, by sourcing, let's say, sports images that would have the other day, that it became sort of a seductive device, if you will, to bring people in to a different dialogue, and I like that. So that's one of the ways. But I guess what I'm really intrigued by was several things. What I'm really intrigued by the installation is that trying to think about other ways to somehow, engage spatially, So that's why I've been really, drawn to this exhibition, because there was a certain abandonment about his work that I think in a lot of ways, I may come off, but I feel a little more conservative around certain ways. So for me, this is very much an invitation, very much looking to seeing what type of work can come out of after this encounter. But one of the things I'm also interested in the archival, impulse and the strong archival impulse in the work and what that says, because it relates to the question about what would happen afterwards. Well, what do we do with what we actually have in terms of what was that? Considering the Kokomos, considering addiction, considering use, the incessant putting down, mapping down one's identity, mapping down one's pleasure and desire. I'm interested in what that meant in terms of if he somehow says he has a lot of faith, maybe that was a sacrificial. Maybe what he did to allow for this other thing to happen that may not be predicated on him being within the physical, being in the body. The fact that maybe it's the spirit or the energy that he actually offered us or Brazil, and what do we do with that? That for me is a question that I think about. But I'm curious I hope that answers your question, but for the three academics up here, considering considering the archival impulse, and looking at, let's say, in how do you pronounce it? Neurotica. Neurotica. I'm curious about it was WBLS, the 70s. It very much transported me back to a particular, I was young at the time, clearly, but there was a certain, I'm interested in terms of your archival work. Have you been able to identify the men, if you will, in Babylon's Nest? Because I feel like in a way, that's why I think a biography would be interesting to think about the way in which Janae was brilliantly captured by Evan White in terms of getting to the biography. Who are these subjects in relationship? Because I think in a way we could re-fetishize those men, the trans, whatever, and how do we actually have a project that actually begins to start bringing those particular subjects? One could say the same thing about Alan Baltrop's, let's say, the Peers, or, Mapplethorpe's, like, say, in the Black Book. I'm interested in terms of my archive project, what it means to really begin to identify. In fact, recently, there was one photograph, that I took in the venue 25 years ago. It was Christine Sharp, who actually delivered a talk, at the Whitney on race and violence. And I wasn't even, I remember photographing her 30 years ago, so it was 1992, but it was only very recently through Tavio, this performance theorist, that I was able to identify. So what does it mean to really begin to identify those people within the archive? People, we have the artist, we have the theorists, right, the historians, etc. But what about those other subjects? And I think, who maybe actually fall off of the grid, if that makes any sense. And can we somehow bring an identity to them? And we can just talk about this in relationship to the Lords of, is this the...
sort of just I'll say something quickly and maybe open up for more questions. But, I think, Freddy and I and other people who have studied Oiticica's work have tried to track down, Oiticica's friends and talk to them as much as possible. And of course, not everyone we can track down. Some of the golden boys of Neurotica we know. Some are around, some are not. But there's many that we don't. But I think what's really important and interesting is that Oiticica himself was extremely generous and is always naming the people that he was collaborating with and so on and so forth. And attending to that does open up these other worlds. So there's some documentation of this, I believe, in the show on a monitor. But this is not at first people thought that this was a work by Oiticica, but really what this is Oiticica accompanying his friend Martine Barra, who's this woman, who had this very interesting project where she was going to the Bronx and she was talking with people who were involved in these gangs, and this is kind of the height of gang warfare at the Bronx. and having them also record their own stories and film each other and so on. So this is Oiticica really just accompanying her and documenting her project. So I think that part of what's really amazing about working on somebody like Oiticica, who himself is a kind of node and within a network, is that there are so many other kinds of practices that we're able to kind of access through him. Because again, as Fregi said, I mean, he is a kind of, he's email and the internet before the fact. And because he was so obsessive about his own archive, he dated things sometimes even to the minute.
Why do you think that? I mean, can we talk a bit about the why do you think? What drove that? I mean, what?
The archive fever, you're saying?
Yeah, the archive fever. Yeah. I mean, in
His father was a scientist, and he worked with his father in some of his research, and he was the responsible for the files.
Oiticica.
Yeah,
Okay.
Oiticica was
His father was an entomologist.
His father was an entomologist,
classifying,
and he was always
4.
classifying, you know. He was always classifying and put things in files, you know. And maybe this is one of the motives of the archive fever they're saying, right? But at the same time, I think that he was so aware of his own work process, that he knew that he had to write this process, you know, to not be understood in the future, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. He has this kind of preoccupation, of concerning about his work. Like, my work's not, there's a lot of concepts in my work. There's a lot of ideas in my work that I'm creating. So I have to write down this, you know, but the idea of the archive, to organize everything, probably has a relation with his father. And maybe his grandfather, because he was a very peculiar guy. He was an anarchist, a big one in Brazil, and he was also a grammar teacher. So he organized the language and disorganized the politics, you know, at the same time. And the father was a scientist and an avant-garde photographer. So all the time, the delirium and the organization came together, you know, or the, that's it, I think. I think so. There's a lot of things to know about Hélio still, you know, a lot of things.
We have one question.
On the top of the entomology, the one piece was called Asigaha. Can you talk a little bit more about that one in relation to the bigger meaning behind that title?
A cigarra is the name of a magazine in Brazil that shows that fashion essay,
Yeah,
right?
that's not his work. Yeah. It's his work is used as a backdrop for this fashion spread in the magazine A Cigarra.
And that essay,
Moda en Vanguarda.
yeah, that makes a big problem in Brazil at that time, because I think it was the Pedro Scotteg's wife who's trying to do that all the time. You know, and Hélio was kind of resistant about it, but she did it.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of slides.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, thank you for these really incredible insights. I wanted to ask whether you could elaborate on whether or not labor figured into his thinking about his art, his approaches. I realize, as you mentioned, politics were never overtly the message of his media, but insofar as the left party, Communist Party, was kind of the hub of political action, and that was kind of the identity for political resistance in many ways, and that at the time was responding to the challenges of industrialization. Questions surrounding labor seemed to figure quite largely in Brazil at this time. And also it seems like Brasilia seemed to be something particularly strong in the imaginary, to which poets, writers, Clarice Lispector, many different architects were responding to. And then I'd recently gone to see Ligia Pape's work, with whom I wasn't familiar with before. But she seems later on in her work to actually begin thinking about vernacular construction and questions around craft and labor and how that figures into art. And then the second quick question, kind of to tack on to the trickiness of thinking the political through his work is I was so struck by the Seja Marginal, Seja Heroin banner. And that would be, I guess, the one very overt anti-dictatorship political piece that he's done. But given that he's so interested in his work in activating the body in particular ways, I was wondering if he ever addressed the question of the many different, diverse ways that bodies were becoming oppressed in the 1970s. Torture under various military regimes across Latin America, but also the really violent processes of decolonization that was happening in the 1970s as well. Thanks.
I can just say very quickly about the question of labor. This is very important because he had this concept that I mentioned before of cree leisure. And so although labor is the focus, as you said, of much of the leftist resistance, the notion of the proletariat as the basis by which a resistance to the dictatorship could be launched, he was against that notion of essentially falling into a pre-existing division of, say, entertainment and labor. In 1967, 68, he starts to read Marcuse and is also very much likes this kind of critique of. And so Cré-Lazare is to move away from labor as both a kind of mode of affiliation, but also almost a moral mode, right? It's to do nothing. So what would it mean to create a kind of resistance by doing nothing, by being lazy? And I think that's, to me, the question is how to think coherently about the politics that might emerge from that kind of gesture, as opposed to the one of the message.
Yeah. No, yeah, sure. I totally agree.
Do you want to say anything about Seja Marginal, Seja Heroin?
Yeah, that banner for Hélio has a special meaning because the idea of the outlaw as a hero is not just like a romantic way to talk about the outlaw people of that moment. It's because at that moment in Brazil, in the middle of the 60s, and until today, the outlaw people, their body, their lives, they just, people don't care, they don't matter, right? And that picture in the banner was a picture of a robber, died, assassin for a policeman, right? And just, the body was just thrown in a little river, urban one, right? And Hélio had a lot of friends in this situation. A lot of friends of Hélio was in prison, a lot of friends of Hélio was died by policemen, and
He himself went to jail once, right?
no, I don't know, never. Lucky him, because all of his
Surprising,
friends.
actually.
Yeah, and like one of the biggest friends of Hélio at that time, a designer, a philosopher, a poet called Rogério Duarte, in 1968, in April of 1968, he took them to prison and then tortured them, and they released them. They were the first intellectual at that time, first artist that was tortured, and then they released them, and they make a strong statement in the newspapers at that time. So the idea of being a marginal and a hero is more like to put on that kind of person a public position and not just let them be erased, you know what I mean? The outlaw people in Brazil or in many countries, they are bodies with no names, right? They're just killed, and you saw a picture in the newspaper with publicity there and a totally different subject. So you just read like that. And then at that moment was trying to mark that. So he wrote a lot of texts about that, the idea of the anti-hero, the anonymous hero, and all these ideas was connected with this feeling that people just don't care about this kind of bodies, you know what I mean? And you have to put that on a banner to remember and to mark that they are the real heroes of that moment. It's not a romantic stuff like, oh my God, the bandits, the outlaws, they are heroes because they're against the law. It's not that. It's more important than that. It's like they existed, you know what I mean? And they are here together with us. And he always says something like that. For him, it was very complex, the idea that the robbers was, with him, friends, delightful people, you know what I mean? They were always doing things together. And you have to think that be a robber in Brazil in 1967, 1964, 1965 is not like the guys that today walking through with
Machine guns.
R15, how is that in English? The fuzil?
Fuzzies, right?
Yeah, you know what I mean? The big guns, you know, that we have now in Rio in the hand of 15, 16 years old young guys, right? At that time was romantic idea of being a robber as like doing little things, you know? And Cara de Cavalo, the guy that is inside one of the bólides, the homage to Cara de Cavalo, he died, I said yesterday, he died because he was in the wrong time, in the wrong place, you know? And he died, and and he killed one of the most important policemen at that time in Rio. And then he became chased by the whole police crew in Rio at that time, and he was killed with hundreds of bullets, you know? So this kind of brutality over the outlaws in Brazil at that time, for Hélio, was a very important issue. So the political situation in Brazil between dictatorship, left wings, you know, this kind of people, they doesn't matter at that time, you know, they don't matter at that time, right? But for Hélio, they are the real heroes. Well, I'm just repeating myself, but you got it, right? And sorry, you talk about Brasilia, right? Something about Brasilia, if Brasilia has some importance for Hélio's work, you're saying?
Yeah, I guess I did it. I was attaching that more to the industrial.
All right.
Its construction had highlighted so many disparities.
All right, yeah.
I think, is that a knowing look? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last thoughts from you guys.
Just to...
I think to spend a lot of time in the exhibition, but you know, that there's like so many other, there's so much. I mean, if you read Portuguese or even if you don't, I mean, there's tons and tons of writings. I mean, there's so many labyrinths to kind of understand Oiticica's work further. So I guess just to encourage everyone to do that.
We could finish with a sentence that he said when he came back to Brazil, when asked, what kind of work you have now, I said, I'm sitting over dynamite. This is the idea that you have to keep in your mind about Hélio Oiticica's work, you know? Sitting over dynamite, you know?
Sitting over dynamite.
Yes, he said that. Lyle was a very